The heavy, hollow thud of a massive fist striking the woman standing by the cold stone hearth froze completely, the small grinding wheel slipping from her trembling fingers and hitting the dirt floor with a dull, sickening crack. She did not breathe. She did not dare to even twitch. Behind her, huddled in the darkest, most shadowed corner of the single-room dwelling, her two young sons clung to each other like frightened animals. Their eyes were wide, white, and completely terrified in the gloom. They knew exactly who was on the other side of that splintering wooden door. They knew exactly what that violent knocking meant. It was the creditor, and he had not come for money today. He had come for them. This was the brutal, unyielding reality of life in ancient Israel. There were no bankruptcy protections, no courts of appeal, no sympathetic judges, sitting in high chairs ready to listen to a grieving widow plead her desperate case. There was only the law of the ledger, cold, absolute, and utterly unforgiving. If a man owed a debt and could not pay it in silver, his property was seized without question. If he had no property left, his ancestral land was taken. And if he had no land, if he had been stripped down to the very dirt beneath his feet, the final currency accepted by the law was human life. Her husband had been a good, righteous man. He was not a gambler who threw his wages away in the dark alleys. He was not a drunkard, nor a fool who made reckless wagers. He was a man of the prophets, a devoted student of the holy texts, a man who had dedicated every waking breath to serving his God and his broken community. But spiritual devotion did not put warm bread on the table, and immense faith did not build a shield against the sudden, devastating strike of illness. When the sudden fever took him in the middle of the night, it took absolutely everything. It left her with a shattered heart, an empty, silent home, and a mountain of crushing financial obligations that she could never hope to escape. The silver he had been forced to borrow merely to keep his family alive during the long, bitter famine was now violently past due, loaded with vicious, compounding interest that multiplied like a ravenous plague. The knocking came again, louder this time, violently splintering the fragile silence of the dusty morning. It shook the dry clay from the ceiling beams. Open the door. The voice outside was like dragging a heavy, jagged stone across loose gravel. She moved slowly, her legs feeling like blocks of solid lead. She slid the wooden latch back with a trembling hand and pulled the door open just enough to see the wealthy man standing in the blinding, merciless sunlight. He was dressed in fine, pristine linen, a stark and cruel contrast to her own threadbare, stained tunic. His face betrayed absolutely no emotion. There was no pity in his jawline, no hesitation in his rigid stance. He did not even bother to look at her face. He looked straight past her shoulder, his cold, calculating eyes landing directly on the two trembling boys cowering in the dark corner. "The grace period is over," he said, his voice flat, absolute, and devoid of any human warmth. "The silver is due today. I have nothing," she whispered, the desperate words tasting like dry ash in her mouth. "You know my husband died. You know the sickness took everything we had left. We have sold the furniture. Fold the animals. Please, just give me a little more time. I can find work. I can glean the fields behind the harvesters. I will scrub floors. Just a few more weeks." The creditor slowly shook his head, completely unaffected by the tears welling in her exhausted eyes. "The time for extensions has passed. The ledger must be balanced. If you do not have the exact weight of silver in my hand by sunset tomorrow, the law is entirely on my side. I will return, and I will take your two sons. They will become my property. They will work the fields in iron chains to pay off their father's debt." He did not wait for her to cry out. He did not wait for a response. He simply turned his back and walked away into the busy, dusty street, leaving a literal death sentence hanging heavily in the stagnant air of her home. The widow collapsed against the doorframe, her knees finally giving out completely. She slid down the rough wood to the dirt floor and buried her face in her dirty hands. A ragged sob ripped from her chest, primal, guttural sound of absolute, bottomless despair. Her boys rushed across the room to her, throwing their small, thin arms around her neck, burying their faces in her shoulders. They were crying too, weeping loudly, understanding exactly what had just been decreed upon them. Tomorrow at sunset, that was all the time they had left on this earth as a family. Tomorrow at sunset, large men with iron shackles would march into this home, brutally tear her screaming children from her arms, and drag them away into a lifetime of forced labor, brutal beatings, and endless misery. She would never see them grow into strong men. She would never see them marry or have children of their own. They would be property, mere numbers on a rich man's cold ledger, paying with their sweat and blood for a debt they did not create. Panic began to claw viciously at her throat, suffocating her, but she forced it down with sheer, desperate willpower. She could not fall apart. Not yet. She had to fight. She was a mother, and a mother does not surrender her children to the chains without waging a war. But who could she fight? City magistrates would immediately side with the wealthy creditor. Her extended relatives were just as impoverished as she was, struggling simply to keep themselves from starving. She had already scavenged the house bare. There was absolutely nothing left to sell, nothing left to barter, no hidden treasure buried under the floorboards. Then, a single, desperate, blinding thought pierced through the suffocating darkness of her panic. Elisha, Elisha, the man of God, the great prophet who had boldly taken the legendary mantle of Elijah. He was the undisputed leader of the prophets, the very man her husband had faithfully served until his dying breath. If anyone in the entire vast nation of Israel had the spiritual authority and the raw power to intervene in this nightmare, it was him. "Stay right here," she told her sons, grouping their small shoulders fiercely and looking deeply into their tear-stained, terrified eyes. "Lock this door behind me. Bolt it tight. Do not open it for anyone. Do you hear me?" "Absolutely no one." The older boy nodded bravely, thick tears streaming down his dirty cheeks, sliding the heavy wooden bolt firmly into place. The exact moment she stepped out into the blinding heat of the day, she ran. She ran frantically through the narrow, winding, chaotic streets of the city, her bare feet cutting and bleeding on the sharp cobblestones, the brutal midday sun beating down relentlessly on her back. She did not stop to rest in the shade. He did not stop to drink from the public wells. Her lungs burned like fire, her vision blurred with exhaustion and tears, but the horrific, vivid image of her sons bound in heavy iron chains pushed her forward through the immense pain. She burst violently through the dense marketplace crowds, ignoring the angry shouts of merchants and the strange, judgmental looks of passers-by, driven solely by the fierce, unstoppable protective instinct of a mother fighting a desperate war for her children's very lives. When she finally located Elisha, he was seated quietly in the shade, surrounded by a large circle of his devoted followers. She did not wait for permission to approach. She broke violently through the circle of men and threw herself face down into the choking dust, directly at the prophet's feet. "My husband is dead." The words tore from her raw throat, agonizing and loud, carrying over the quiet murmurs of the stunned crowd. "Your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know perfectly well that he revered the Lord with all his heart. Now his creditor is coming. The creditor is coming tomorrow at sunset to take my 2 boys as his slaves." She stayed pressed against the hot ground, weeping uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking violently. She fully expected Elisha to offer a loud, dramatic prayer to the heavens, perhaps to take up an emergency collection of silver among the gathered prophets, or maybe even to march righteously down to the creditor's massive estate and demand holy justice in the name of the Almighty God. Instead, Elisha looked down at the broken, weeping widow with a profound, deeply unsettling calmness. He did not panic. He did not express righteous outrage. He simply asked her a question that made absolutely no logical sense in the face of her impending doom. "How can I help you?" Elisha asked gently, his voice smooth and incredibly steady. "Tell me, what do you have in your house?" The widow stopped crying entirely and slowly looked up at him in total, baffled confusion. What did she have in her house? Was he deaf? Was he not listening to a single word she had just screamed? She had just told him she was utterly, completely destitute. The creditor had already stripped them down to bare dirt. Why on earth would the great prophet of Israel ask such a ridiculous, foolish question? while the clock was loudly ticking toward her son's enslavement. Your servant has nothing there at all, she answered bitterly, wiping the thick dust and tears from her hollow cheeks. Nothing, absolutely nothing, except a tiny, small jar of olive oil. It was the painful, humiliating truth. Sitting uselessly on the cold stone hearth back in her barren home was a tiny, cracked clay flask. Held perhaps 3 or 4 ounces of oil, barely enough to mix with a single handful of flour to bake one final, miserable, flat piece of bread before they starved or were dragged away in chains. It was utterly worthless. It would not pay off a fraction of a single copper coin, let alone a towering mountain of predatory debt. Elisha nodded slowly, his eyes bright and piercing, as if this tiny, pathetic detail was the grand key to unlocking the very universe. Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars, Elisha commanded her, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. Do not ask for just a few. Ask for every single empty vessel they can spare. And go inside your house and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. Wade stared at him, her mouth slightly open in profound disbelief. Gather empty jars? Pour out her tiny, insignificant flask? It defied all human logic. It was completely absurd. The deadly deadline was rapidly approaching. The sun was continuing its relentless march across the sky. Her sons were merely hours away from a lifetime of slavery, and the prophet wanted her to spend her precious final moments collecting useless garbage from her neighbors. But as she looked deeply into Elisha's eyes, she saw absolutely no hesitation, only ironclad absolute certainty. Her dead husband had trusted this man with his life. Her husband had trusted the invisible God. This man served. She had no silver, no legal standing, no other options, and no other hope in the world. It was either follow this ridiculous, nonsensical plan or surrender to the chains. She stood up slowly, brushed the heavy dust from her bruised knees, bowed her head in silent submission, and turned back toward the chaotic city. When she finally arrived back in her impoverished neighborhood, she immediately began the most humiliating, agonizing task of her entire life. She walked up to the sturdy wooden door of her closest neighbor and knocked timidly. When the woman answered, the widow swallowed her deep pride, her voice shaking with profound shame. "Please," she asked, staring at her dirt-stained feet, "do you have any empty jars I could borrow?" The neighbor looked at her with deep pity, knowing full well the financial tragedy that had struck her home, and silently handed over a large, heavy, empty clay water pot. She moved to the next house. And the next. She walked down narrow, foul-smelling alleys, knocking desperately on the doors of people she barely even knew, begging for their empty, useless vessels. Some looked at her like she had completely lost her mind, a grieving, bankrupt, desperate widow, spending her final day of freedom, collecting empty clay pots. But they gave them to her anyway, eager to get the crazy woman off their doorsteps. Her sons, seeing their mother working outside with such a frantic, desperate purpose, quickly unbolted their door and rushed out into the street to help her. Together, the 3 of them dragged immensely heavy stone water basins, cracked earthen pitchers, and massive ceramic storage jars down the dusty street. They hauled them one by agonizing one into their tiny, cramped house. The sun was sinking lower and lower, casting long, menacing, sharp shadows across the city streets. The deadly deadline was rapidly approaching. The creditor and his ruthless men would soon be walking down this very road. "Eat more," she told her exhausted sons, her voice tight, high, and thick with mounting anxiety. "Bring every empty thing you can find. Beg for them if you have to." At late afternoon, their small, dark house was completely impassable. It was filled wall to wall, floor to ceiling, with dozens and dozens of empty, hollow vessels. There was barely enough room for the 3 of them to stand together in the center of the room. Widow last furred 5p4, one last, terrified time, watching the massive orange sun inch perilously closer to the jagged horizon. She violently pulled her 2 exhausted sons inside, grabbed the heavy wooden door, and pulled it shut with a loud bang. She slid the thick iron bolt across the latch with a loud, definitive clack that echoed in the dark room. They were entirely sealed inside. Just the terrified mother, her two trembling boys, massive towering mountain of empty jars, and a single tiny worthless flask of oil. "Bring me the first jar," she whispered, her voice barely audible over her pounding heart. The older boy grunted as he struggled to push a massive, thick stone basin toward the center of the cramped room. It was large enough to easily hold 20 gallons of water. The mother looked down at the tiny clay flask, resting in her trailing, calloused hands. It felt incredibly light. It held perhaps 3 drops of oil left. She took a deep, shaky breath, closed her eyes tightly, praying a silent, desperate prayer to the God of Elisha, and tipped the small flask over the edge of the massive stone basin. A thin, shimmering golden stream of pure olive oil began to flow from the tiny spout. It hit the dry, dusty bottom of the basin with a soft, echoing splash. She waited for the thin stream to sputter, cough, and die completely. She waited for the last few pathetic drops to fall. She waited for the crushing, inescapable reality of her failure to crash down upon her shoulders. But the oil kept pouring. It flowed in a steady, unbroken, heavy ribbon of liquid gold. The rich, earthy, incredibly fragrant scent of pure, unblemished olive oil instantly filled the stifling, hot room. Her sons gasped out loud, dropping instantly to their knees on the hard dirt floor, watching in absolute, paralyzed shock as the dark pool of oil at the bottom of the massive basin began to rise higher and higher. 5 long seconds passed, 10 seconds, a full minute. The tiny flask in her hand should have been bone dry 50 times over by now, yet it felt as though a hidden, eternal, rushing spring had suddenly opened up inside of it. The oil poured and poured, incredibly smooth and completely relentless. The large stone basin was now half full, then 3/4 full. Finally, the thick, golden liquid crested the very rim of the stone vessel, perfectly flush with the top. "Bring me another," she cried out, her voice breaking violently with a chaotic mixture of deep terror and ecstatic, overwhelming joy. Her younger son quickly shoved a tall, narrow ceramic pitcher beneath the golden stream. She did not even have to tip the flask upright to pause. She just moved her hand over, and the oil continued to flow heavily without missing a single beat. It filled the tall pitcher in mere seconds. "Another," she commanded loudly, tears streaming down her face. They brought a wide clay pot, filled, a narrow drinking jug, filled, a cracked vessel that they had been forced to patch with dried mud, filled perfectly to the brim. The dark, depressing room was rapidly, impossibly transforming right before their very eyes. What had been a pathetic graveyard of empty, worthless containers was now rapidly becoming a royal treasure house of immense, incalculable wealth. Pure olive oil was incredibly valuable in the ancient world. It was vital for cooking, essential for lighting lamps in the dark, crucial for medicinal healing, and required for sacred anointing. And this oil, pouring endlessly from this miraculous, bottomless flask, was clearly of the absolute highest, most pristine, flawless quality ever seen. Widow's tears flowed just as freely as the golden oil. Every single vessel that was filled to the brim was another heavy iron chain broken violently off her son's wrists. Every gallon that crested a ceramic rim was a brutal month of debt permanently erased. The crushing, suffocating weight that had rested heavily on her chest for months was literally washing away in this golden, fragrant river. She moved frantically now, twisting and turning in the impossibly cramped space, filling pot after pot after pot. Her arms ached terribly from holding the flask suspended in the air, but she absolutely would not stop. The boys were working just as feverishly, sliding heavy, full jars carefully out of the way and violently pushing empty ones forward, their faces brightly illuminated by the dim light slipping through the cracks in the walls, shining with sweat, tears, and absolute awe. They were witnessing the impossible. They were standing directly in the middle of a stunning, world-altering miracle, safely behind locked doors, completely hidden from the cruelty and judgment of the outside world. Finally, she finished filling a massive, towering urn, the dark oil reaching the very brim without spilling a drop. She turned, keeping the small flask tipped, eagerly waiting for the next empty vessel to be pushed in front of her. "Bring me another one," she called out, breathless, her eyes shining wildly in the dim light. The older boy stood up straight and looked around the cramped room. The dirt floor was completely covered. Every surface, every shadowed corner, every single inch of available space was occupied by a heavy vessel brimming with pure, perfect oil. "There is not a jar left," he whispered, staring wide-eyed at the absolute fortune surrounding them in the tiny home. The widow looked down at her small hand. The very exact second her son spoke those words, the thick golden stream abruptly and permanently stopped. Not a single drop more fell from the lip of the tiny clay flask. It was finally, truly, physically empty. The silence in the room was incredibly deafening, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of an exhausted mother and her two stunned sons. They stood perfectly still, entirely overwhelmed by the rich fragrance of the oil and the staggering, undeniable reality of what had just happened in their home. They had started the day with absolutely nothing but a terrifying death sentence. They were ending it completely surrounded by unimaginable, life-changing wealth. But the danger was not entirely gone. The sun was rapidly setting. The creditor was still coming. She quickly unbolted the heavy door and ran faster than she ever had in her entire life, racing back through the cooling streets to the prophet Elisha. She did not fall at his feet this time. She stood tall before him, her cheek clothes stained heavily with expensive oil, her face glowing with a fierce, triumphant, undeniable light, and proudly told him everything that had occurred behind those closed doors. Elisha smiled, quiet, knowing smile. He did not ask for a single share of the wealth. He did not demand public praise or recognition. He simply gave her the final, liberating instruction. "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts," he said clearly. "You and your sons can easily live on what is left." She did not waste a single second. She secured a wealthy merchant immediately in the market square. When the seasoned merchant saw the flawless quality of the oil, his eyes went incredibly wide. He quickly brought his sturdy carts, and his men carefully loaded the heavy, brimming jars. Thick silver pieces were heavily weighed out on the merchant's brass scales, and massive, incredibly heavy leather pouches of coins passed securely into the widow's hands. The sheer amount was staggering to behold. It was not just enough to pay the predatory debt. It was enough to completely secure their financial future for years and years to come. Just as the merchant's heavy wooden carts rolled away down the dusty street, the terrifying sound the widow had been dreading all day finally arrived at her home. The heavy, hollow thud of a fist striking the cedar door. The boys instantly stiffened, their previous terror instantly returning to their wide eyes. But the widow did not freeze this time. She did not drop to the floor in despair. She stood remarkably tall, squared her shoulders fiercely, and walked to the door with steady, powerful, purposeful steps. She pulled the door wide open. The wealthy creditor stood there, bathed completely in the blood-red light of the setting sun. Directly behind him stood two incredibly large, imposing men, holding thick, terrifying iron chains in their hands. The creditor looked at her, his face a hard mask of cold, unyielding expectation. "The sun has set," he declared loudly, his voice completely devoid of any human mercy. "The debt is due. Bring out the boys right now." The widow did not look away. She did not tremble. She did not beg for her life. She reached calmly into the deep folds of her tunic, pulled out a massive, incredibly heavy leather pouch, and dropped it violently at the creditor's sandaled feet. A heavy pouch hit the hard dirt with a loud, metallic, ringing crash, bursting open slightly at the top seam. Dozens and dozens of pure, shining silver coins spilled out into the dust, catching the dying light of the sun and reflecting it back into the creditor's stunned eyes. The wealthy man froze completely, his eyes locked desperately on the sheer fortune lying casually in the dirt. The two large men with the iron chains stepped back in absolute shock, their mouths hanging open. "Count it," she said, her voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. "The principal. The predatory interest. Every single copper coin my late husband ever owed you is sitting right there in the dirt. Count it now and leave my property forever." The creditor slowly sank to his trembling knees, his hands shaking violently as he frantically gathered the bright silver, weighing it desperately in his hands, inspecting it for flaws. He looked up at the widow, completely bewildered and thoroughly defeated. He looked past her into the barren, empty room, desperately trying to comprehend how a destitute, bankrupt woman had produced a literal king's ransom in a matter of hours. But he had absolutely no legal right to ask. Cruel law was the law. The ledger was perfectly balanced. The debt was entirely paid in full. He stood up slowly, clutching the heavy pouch tightly to his chest like a shield, frantically signaled to the confused men with the chains, and walked away rapidly into the gathering twilight without saying a single word. The widow stood proudly in the doorway, watching them disappear completely down the street until they were nothing but faint shadows in the distance. The cool, refreshing evening breeze swept through the quiet city, carrying away the oppressive heat and the sheer terror of the long day. She turned around slowly and looked at her two boys. They were no longer hiding in the dark. They were standing in the center of the room, safe, free, and utterly amazed. She walked over to them, falling to her knees, and pulled them into a fierce, unbreakable embrace. The nightmare was finally over. The debt was paid. They were completely free.